She slid one extra bowl of porridge across the counter and said, "It got made by mistake. You'd be doing me a favor if you took it off my hands." That was the morning 9-year-old Liam Ockhafer learned what it looked like when someone protected your dignity without asking permission to do it. And that was the morning Evelyn Adebio, 48 years old, 3 months into widowhood, running a porridge stall she had built from her husband's last salary, decided quietly and without ceremony that a barefoot child with hungry eyes was not going to walk past her window one more time without eating. If you believe quiet kindness carries a weight the world doesn't measure right, please subscribe to this channel. Stay with this story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far a woman like Evelyn travels. The Kalu market on the eastern edge of Lagos had been standing on that patch of red earth since before the road was paved. It was the kind of market that had never appeared on a tourist map and never wanted to. Corrugated iron roofing patched with tarpaulin. Wooden stalls leaning against each other the way old friends lean against each other, holding one another up out of long habit. In the mornings, before the sun cleared the low buildings east of the market, the whole place smelled of wood smoke and pepper soup and the particular sweetness of ripe plantains left out overnight. Traders arrived at 4. Customers arrived by 6. And by 6:30, when the light was still gray and the puddles in the alleyways still held the color of the sky, Evelyn Adebio had her charcoal fire lit and her big aluminum pot going and her small handwritten sign propped against the corner of stall number 7 that read simply, "Evelyn's Kitchen, Ogi, Akara," since 1985. She had painted the sign herself. It was the only sign she had ever painted. She had done it 2 weeks after Adebio Sr. died of a heart the doctors had not seen coming, and she had done it because she had 4 children at home and 1,000 naira left in a coffee tin under the bed, and she had needed something to put her hands on that felt like a decision. The stall had been that decision. She had bought the pot second-hand from a woman leaving for Kano. She had bought the charcoal on credit from a man who had known her husband. She had woken at 3 every morning for a week to teach herself how to make ogi properly, the way her mother had made it in the village before the village was a place Evelyn could go back to. And she had opened stall number 7 on a Monday in November of 1985, and she had not missed a Monday since. That was who Evelyn Adebio was. The woman who lost the person the world had told her she was supposed to lean on, and then quietly, without fanfare, decided to become the thing worth leaning on herself. 20 years later, the flyer went up on the corner post of the market. White paper, red border, official government seal in the upper left. The words at the top were printed large enough that people in the 3rd row of stalls could read them from where they stood. Notice of intended demolition. Below that in smaller type, this structure is scheduled for demolition by order of the city authority. Below that a date. Below the date, 3 lines about a new development project that would rise on this land within the next 18 months. The Kalu Modern Plaza, a commercial and retail complex, signed and sealed and final. Evelyn read the flyer at 7:30 in the morning with her hands still smelling of ground corn. She read it twice. She did not react the way the younger traders were already reacting behind her. The raised voices, the hands going to heads, the woman 2 stalls down who had begun to cry in the particular quiet way of a person who has been crying about smaller things for weeks and has just been given permission to cry about a bigger one. Evelyn read the notice a 3rd time to make sure she had the date correct. Then she folded her reading glasses into her apron pocket and walked back to stall number 7 and stirred the ogi with the wooden spoon her husband had carved for her in the 2nd year of their marriage, and she thought about the boy. She had not seen him in 20 years. She thought about him almost every morning. The first time Liam had come to the market, he had been 9 years old, and Evelyn had noticed him the way you notice a bruise on a piece of fruit. He had been standing across the alley near the fabric seller's stall, and he had been watching her fry akara, and he had not moved for 11 minutes. Evelyn had counted, not because she was trying to count, but because the wristwatch her husband had given her ticked loud enough to hear in the small, quiet spaces of morning trade, and she had watched the second hand go around 11 times while the boy watched her pan. He was barefoot. His shorts were held up with a length of twine. His shirt had been someone else's shirt before it was his, and someone else's before that, and the collar was frayed in the specific way collars fray when a garment has been washed hundreds of times in cold water and beaten against a stone. His arms were thin, not fashionably thin. Thin the way children get when the math of their meals stops working. Evelyn had looked at him. He had looked at her. Then he had looked at the ground and turned to walk away. "Small boy," she had called out, not loud, loud enough. He had stopped. He had not turned around. "I made too much this morning," Evelyn had said, "and if I don't sell it in the next few minutes it will go to waste, and I hate to see food go to waste. Come and take this one off my hands." She had wrapped a piece of akara and a small portion of ogi in newspaper the way she wrapped orders for the market porters who bought from her on credit, and she had held it out toward the alley without looking at him directly, because she had understood already in the 11 minutes she had watched him watch her that this was a boy who had learned to read pity across a room, and pity was the one thing he would not accept. He had come to the counter. He had taken the wrapped food. He had looked at her with eyes that were too old for his face, and he had said in a voice so small she had almost missed it, "Thank you, Ma." "What is your name?" she had asked. "Liam, Ma." "Liam what?" He had hesitated. "Just Liam, Ma." Evelyn had understood that too. A child who gave only a first name was a child who did not have a household behind him to give a second name to. She had nodded once as though this were the most ordinary information in the world and had gone back to her frying. He had come back the next morning. He had stood in the same spot across the alley. Evelyn had wrapped a portion in newspaper before he had finished standing still, and she had held it out again, and she had said, "I made too much again. This place is going to bankrupt me if I keep miscalculating." Liam had come to the counter. He had taken the food. He had said, "Thank you, Ma." By the end of the first week, Evelyn had learned 3 things about the boy. He slept somewhere near the disused railway yard behind the market, because that was the direction he walked in when he left. He had no mother or father that anyone in the market knew of, because Evelyn had asked the fabric seller and the fabric seller had asked the porter, and the porter had asked the night watchman, and the answer had come back the same from all 3. Nobody had seen a family. And he was, despite everything the world had done to reduce him, a boy who noticed things. He noticed that Evelyn's youngest daughter, Ifoma, had come to the stall on Thursday with a scraped knee, and on Friday morning when he came for his portion, he had a small wildflower in his hand that he had picked from the roadside, and he had put it on the counter without looking at Evelyn and said, "For the small girl with the knee." He noticed that on Monday mornings the charcoal took longer to catch because the weekend damp had gotten into the sacks, and by the 3rd Monday he had started arriving 15 minutes before Evelyn opened, and he had begun the fire himself with a patience no 9-year-old should have possessed. And when Evelyn had arrived on that 3rd Monday and found her fire already lit, and the boy sitting quietly beside it with his hands folded, she had stood in the alley for a long moment before she trusted her voice to say good morning. They developed a rhythm. Evelyn made 1 extra portion every morning. The mistake, she called it, always the mistake, never the gift. She never once used the word gift, because she understood something the charitable people who came through the market on their fundraising rounds did not understand, which was that a child who has learned to survive on charity develops a specific defense against charity, and the defense is pride, and the pride is the last thing keeping the child upright. And to strip a child of pride in the act of feeding him is to feed his body and starve the part of him that is going to have to walk into the world as a man someday. So Evelyn made the mistake, every morning, for 6 years. Liam grew, not fast, slowly, the way a plant grows when it is not getting quite enough water but has decided to grow anyway. By 11, he was reading the newspaper Evelyn wrapped his food in, and by 12, he was correcting her arithmetic when she counted the day's takings out loud, and by 13, he was helping the fabric seller carry bolts of cloth in the afternoons for a few coins, and by 14, he was enrolled at the small government school 2 kilometers north of the market, which he attended in a uniform that Evelyn had bought him with money she had told him came from a customer who had left a large tip, though there had been no such customer, and Liam, who by 14 was too intelligent to entirely believe her, had accepted the uniform and thanked her and asked no further questions, because he had understood by then that Evelyn Adebio was going to keep protecting his pride whether he cooperated or not, and the least he could do was cooperate. He was 15 when the exam came, the West African Senior School Certificate, the exam that decided whether a child in his position had a future beyond the market or was going to spend his life carrying bolts of cloth for coins. The fee was 1,200 naira. Liam had saved 400 over 8 months from his afternoon work. He had come to the stall on a Tuesday morning in April with the 400 naira wrapped in a handkerchief in his fist, and he had put it on the counter, and he had said, "Ma, I need to ask you something." Evelyn had looked at the money on the counter. She had looked at the boy who was not quite a boy anymore, whose voice had begun to change 6 months earlier, whose shoulders had begun to fill out with the specific angular strength of a young man who had spent his adolescence carrying weight for other people. She had known before he opened his mouth what he was going to ask her, because Evelyn had been paying attention to Liam for 6 years the way Liam had been paying attention to her, and she had known about the exam and the fee and the deadline for weeks. "Ma," Liam said, and he was looking at the counter, not at her, "I have 400. I need 12. I know what I am asking. I know it is not a small thing. I have been thinking about how to ask you for 2 weeks, and I have not been able to think of a way that does not sound like begging, and I am not begging, Ma. I will pay it back, every naira. I will pay it back if it takes me 10 years, I will pay it back." Evelyn had listened. She had not interrupted. She had let him say the whole thing because she had understood that he needed to say it, that the saying was part of what he needed to survive the asking. When he had finished, she had reached under the counter and taken out the small tin box where she kept her rent money. Her rent was due in 9 days. It was 1,500 naira. She had 1,100 in the tin. The other 400 she had been planning to make up over the next week through extra afternoon trade. She had counted out 800 naira. She had added it to the 400 on the counter. She had pushed the 1,200 toward Liam. "You are not paying it back," she had said. "That is the first thing. You are not paying it back to me. If you want to pay it back, you pay it back to the next boy. You find the next boy who is standing in an alley watching somebody fry akara and you pay it to him. That is how you pay it back." Liam had looked at the money. He had looked at Evelyn. His face had done something then that she had not seen his face do in 6 years, which was that it had come apart. Not dramatically. The way a face comes apart when a person has been holding something for a very long time and the holding has finally cost more than they can pay. "Ma," he had said. "Take the money, Liam," Evelyn had said. "Take it before you make me cry, because I have not cried at this counter in 6 years, and I do not intend to start today." He had taken the money. He had folded it into the handkerchief with the 400, and he had put the handkerchief inside his shirt against his skin, and he had wiped his face with the back of his hand once, and he had said, "Yes, Ma." Evelyn had paid her rent 9 days later by selling her wedding ring to a man on Broad Street who had given her 700 naira for it and had known better than to ask why she was selling it. She had not told Liam. She had not told anyone. She had gone back to the market and lit her fire and made her ogi, and when the landlord had come to collect, she had counted out the 1,500 naira and handed it over, and the landlord, who had known her husband, had counted it twice and said, "You are a serious woman, Mrs. Adebio," and Evelyn had said, "I try, sir," and that had been the end of it. Liam had passed the exam in the top 2% of the state. 3 months after the results were posted, a letter had arrived at the market addressed to Liam in care of Evelyn's kitchen, and Liam had opened it at her counter with hands that were trying very hard to be steady and were not entirely succeeding, and he had read it once in silence, and then he had read it again out loud, because he had needed to hear the words in his own voice before he could believe them. A full scholarship. Federal Government College in Enugu, room and board included 4 years, contingent on maintained academic performance. Report date, the 14th of September. Evelyn had listened. She had stirred the ogi with the wooden spoon her husband had carved for her. She had waited until Liam had finished reading, and then she had said, "Well, you had better start packing." He had left on a Tuesday. He had come to the stall at 5:30 in the morning before the market had properly opened, and Evelyn had been there because Evelyn was always there, and she had made him one last portion of ogi and akara, and she had wrapped it in newspaper the way she had wrapped it 1,000 times before, and she had handed it to him across the counter, and she had said, "Do not turn around when you leave. Look forward. That is where you are going." Liam had taken the food. He had looked at her for a long moment with the eyes that had been too old for his face at 9 and were still too old for his face at 15, and he had said, "Ma, I do not know how to." "Then don't," Evelyn had said. "Some things do not need to be said. Some things a person just carries. You go and you carry it." He had nodded once. He had not turned around when he left. He had walked out of the market with the wrapped food in his hand, and the small canvas bag containing everything he owned over his shoulder, and Evelyn had watched him go until he had turned the corner past the fabric seller's stall, and then she had gone back to her fire and stirred her pot and had not stopped stirring it for the next hour, because if her hand kept moving, then her face would stay composed. And Evelyn had learned 20 years earlier at the funeral of her husband that a composed face was a currency a woman in her position could not afford to spend recklessly. She had not seen him again. He had written for the first year. Long letters in a careful hand describing Enugu and his classes and the food at the boarding school, which he assured her was not as good as hers. Then the letters had come less often. Then a letter had come from Kaduna, from a university she had not heard of. Then a letter had come from Johannesburg in South Africa, mentioning something called an engineering fellowship. Then a letter from London, which had contained a photograph of a young man in a graduation gown who Evelyn had studied for a long time before she had recognized as Liam, because his face had filled out and his shoulders had straightened, and he was standing in front of a stone building with a small, careful smile that was the same smile she remembered from the boy at her counter at 14, only settled into itself. The letters had stopped after that. She had assumed. She had understood. She had never told anyone in the market about the boy. She had never told her own children, who were grown now with children of their own, about the 800 naira from the rent tin. She had carried it alone. It had been a private thing between her and a Tuesday morning in April, and she had understood without being told that private things were how a person's soul stayed intact. And now, 20 years later, the notice on the corner post said her market was ending. She had until the 23rd. The notice gave the traders 6 weeks to clear their stalls and vacate the premises. 6 weeks to disassemble what many of them had spent 30 and 40 years assembling. 6 weeks to find alternative locations in a city where alternative locations for market traders had been getting harder to find for a decade, because every year another patch of Lagos was rezoned for commercial development, and another market was pushed further out toward the lagoon or the highway. Evelyn told her children the same evening. Her oldest son, Chindu, who was 42 and worked as an accountant at a firm in Victoria Island, had said what Evelyn had known he would say, which was that this was actually a good thing, that at 81 she should not be running a porridge stall 6 days a week anyway, that she should come and live with him and his wife, that they had the guest room ready. That the market had been the beginning of a chapter and this was the end of that chapter, and there was no shame in endings. Her daughter Ifoma had said something similar. Her youngest son had offered a small monthly allowance. Her second daughter had cried on the phone. Evelyn had listened to all of them. She had thanked them. She had said she would think about their offers. She had gone to the market the next morning at 4 and lit her fire, and she had thought about their offers while she made the ogi, and she had known by the time the first customer arrived at 6 that she was not going to accept any of them, not because she did not love her children, and not because she was too proud to be helped, but because the market was the thing she had built with her own hands after her husband had died. And she was not going to walk away from it into a guest room in Victoria Island as though the last 40 years had been something to be tidied up and put away. She was going to work stall number 7 until the 23rd of the month. She was going to feed her customers until the last morning. She was going to pack her pots and her wooden spoon and her sign with her own hands. And then she was going to walk out of the market in the same direction Liam had walked out 20 years earlier, and she was going to look forward, because forward was where she was going. The 6 weeks passed the way 6 weeks always pass when you are counting them. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The traders around her packed in stages. The fabric seller left first, because she had a niece in Ibadan who had offered her a room and a small shop. The porter left second, because he had found work at the Apapa docks. By the 4th week, the market was half empty, and the alleys that had been crowded with customers and porters and hand trucks for 40 years had begun to have that specific hollow quality that places get when their purpose is leaving them. The wood smoke smell was still there in the mornings, but fainter. The pepper soup smell was still there, but fewer stalls were producing it. Evelyn opened her stall every morning at 6. She served her regular customers. Fewer came each week, because word had spread that the market was closing and the regulars had begun to say their goodbyes and to find new places to buy their morning ogi. But some kept coming until the last week. The old man who had bought a portion from her every Wednesday for 11 years came on his last Wednesday and said, "Mrs. Adebyo, where am I going to eat now?" And Evelyn had said, "Anywhere you eat, sir, you eat with my blessing." The morning of the 23rd was a Thursday. Evelyn arrived at 4, the way she had arrived every morning for 40 years, and she lit her charcoal for the last time, and she made 1 pot of ogi and 1 batch of akara, because there was no point making more, because there were no more customers to make it for. She sat on her small wooden stool behind the counter, and she watched the sun come up over the low buildings east of the market, and she thought about her husband, and she thought about the boy, and she thought about the 800 naira from the rent tin, and she thought about how a person can spend 40 years in one place, and how the place, if you have loved it correctly, becomes part of the person, so that when you leave the place you are not leaving the place at all. You are carrying it with you inside your chest. At 7 she began to pack. There was not much to pack: the pot, the wooden spoon, the small tin box empty now that had held her rent money for 4 decades, the apron with the pocket where she had kept her reading glasses, the hand-painted sign that read Evelyn's Kitchen, Ogi, Akara, since 1985. She wrapped the pot in a piece of old cloth and set it in a plastic basin. She folded the apron. She wiped the counter one last time with a rag, though there was no reason to wipe it, because it was going to be demolished in less than 24 hours, but she wiped it anyway, because Evelyn Adebyo was not the kind of woman who left a counter dirty. A small crowd had gathered by then. Not a large crowd. The traders who had stayed until the last morning. A few of her old regulars who had come to say goodbye. 3 of her grandchildren who Chindu had sent to help her carry her things home. The demolition workers were arriving at the gate in their yellow vests, waiting for the 10 o'clock deadline, drinking from their thermoses, not looking at the traders because they had done demolitions before and they had learned not to look. Evelyn was reaching for the sign to take it down when she heard the engines. 3 black vehicles, not saloon cars. The tall kind, the kind with tinted windows and the specific weight of expensive machinery moving slowly. They came down the road that led into the market from the main thoroughfare, and they stopped at the market gate, and the demolition workers moved out of the way without being asked, because the vehicles had that quality of arrival, the quality that rearranges a road around itself without needing to be told to. The doors opened. 4 men in dark suits stepped out of the first vehicle. They were security. Evelyn understood immediately because she had seen enough men on television and in the newspapers to recognize the way security men held their shoulders. 2 more men stepped out of the third vehicle. They stood beside the doors of the second vehicle and waited. The door of the second vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was tall, not fashionably tall. Tall the way a man is tall when he has grown into his height without apologizing for it. He was wearing a black suit that had been cut for him by a person who understood suits. His shoes were polished. His watch, when the sleeve of his jacket moved, caught the morning light. He was 35 years old, and he had the face of a man who had spent the last 20 years working very hard at something, and had recently begun to succeed at it. And Evelyn Adebio, standing behind her counter with the sign in her hand, and the pot wrapped in cloth at her feet, knew who he was before he had taken his first step toward her. He walked across the wet ground of the market alley in his polished shoes without looking down, because he was not looking at the ground, he was looking at her. The security men stayed near the vehicles. The demolition workers stopped drinking from their thermoses. The traders who had gathered to say goodbye went quiet, the specific quiet of a crowd that has understood something is happening that they do not yet have the shape of. Liam Ockafer stopped in front of stall number 7. He did not speak for a moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at 9 and at 15 and every morning in between, the eyes that were too old for the face, only now the face had grown into the eyes. He looked at the counter she was standing behind, at the pot wrapped in cloth at her feet, at the sign in her hand that said Evelyn's Kitchen. Ogi. Akara. Since 1985. He looked at all of it in the slow, careful way of a man who was cataloging something he had been carrying in his head for 20 years, and was now checking against the real thing to see whether his memory had been accurate. Then he said, in a voice that was low and careful and had a small tremor in it that he was not trying to hide, "Ma." Evelyn's hand tightened on the sign. She did not answer immediately. She could not answer immediately. The word "ma," said in that specific voice by that specific man in that specific place, had gone somewhere in her chest and lodged there, and she needed a moment to breathe around it before she could produce a word of her own. "Liam," she said. He nodded once. His eyes had gone shiny, though he was working to keep them from going further than shiny. "I know I am late," he said. "I know I am very late." "You are not late," Evelyn said quietly. "You are here." The crowd behind him had begun to murmur. One of the traders had recognized his face from the newspapers, because Liam Ockafer had been in the newspapers a great deal in the last 3 years. First, when his engineering firm had won the contract for the new bridge project in Port Harcourt. Then when his development company had been announced as the lead investor in a series of commercial projects across 3 states. Then most recently when the Kalu Modern Plaza had been announced as the flagship of his portfolio. A $200 million investment on the site of a market on the eastern edge of Lagos. The traders were beginning to understand something. Evelyn understood it faster. "You," she said. "The plaza, it is you." "It is me, Ma." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the black vehicles and the men in suits and the demolition crew standing in their yellow vests holding their thermoses. And she looked at stall number 7 that was going to be rubble by evening. And she looked back at Liam, and she said with a small, dry precision that was entirely her own, "You are demolishing my market." "No, Ma," Liam said. "I am not." He turned. He gestured to one of the men who had gotten out of the 3rd vehicle, and the man came forward with a leather folder and opened it, and Liam took a document out of the folder and held it out to her, not for her to take, just for her to see. It was a contract, many pages, legal type. Evelyn could not read the small print without her glasses, but she could see the title at the top of the first page. She could see the seal. "Ma," Liam said, "there is a clause on page 47 of this contract. My lawyers did not understand it when they drafted it. I made them include it anyway. They were not permitted to remove it." He turned to the page. He held it out so she could see the paragraph, the specific paragraph, indented and set apart from the surrounding legal language the way a person sets apart the one sentence in a letter that carries the weight of the whole thing. He read it out loud, because he had known that Evelyn would not have her reading glasses on her, because he had remembered that Evelyn had always kept her reading glasses in her apron pocket, and he had known she had already packed the apron. Stall number 7 of the Kalu market, and its current proprietor, Mrs. Evelyn Adebio, are to be preserved and honored in perpetuity within any structure that rises on this land. The stall itself, its contents, and its operational status are to be maintained as a permanent feature of the development. The proprietor is to be recognized as founding tenant of the redeveloped site, with tenancy rent-free for the duration of her life, and thereafter as a memorial in perpetuity. No amendment to this clause shall be permitted. He folded the page. The market was completely silent. Even the demolition crew had put down their thermoses. One of the traders, an old woman who had run the vegetable stall 2 rows over for 31 years, had put both hands over her mouth. Chindu's oldest child, Evelyn's grandson, a boy of 9 who had come to help carry his grandmother's pots, was looking at Liam with the specific unblinking attention of a child who has just recognized that he is present at something he is going to tell his own children about someday. Evelyn stood behind her counter with the sign in her hand. "You chose this market," she said. "It was not a question. I chose this market, Ma, on purpose. On purpose." She looked at him for a long time. She was not crying. Evelyn Adebio had not cried at this counter in 40 years, and she was not going to start today. But her chest was doing something that was not entirely composed, and her hand on the sign was not entirely steady, and she was aware that she was being watched by a crowd of 30 people, and she was aware that she was going to have to say something soon, because Liam was standing in front of her with the folded contract in his hand waiting, and the men in suits were waiting. And the demolition crew was waiting, and the whole market was waiting, and Evelyn Adebio had spent 40 years understanding what a crowd needed from a woman who was the center of it. She set the sign down carefully on the counter. She looked at Liam. "You paid it back," she said quietly. "You paid it back to the next boy." Liam nodded once. He could not speak. His mouth had done something that was going to become tears if he tried to speak, so he did not try to speak. He nodded. "How many?" Evelyn asked. "Ma, how many boys?" Liam swallowed. 47, Ma, in the last 11 years, full scholarships, every one of them." Evelyn nodded slowly. She looked at the sign on the counter. She looked at the pot wrapped in cloth at her feet. She looked at the demolition crew and the men in suits and the crowd of traders who had come to say goodbye and had ended up saying something else entirely. "Well," she said, in the same tone she had used 40 years earlier when she had told Liam he had better start packing. "You had better tell them to put my counter back." Liam laughed. It came out of him before he had decided to laugh, the specific involuntary laugh of a man who has been holding something for 20 years and has just been given permission to let it go, and the laugh had tears in it, and he did not wipe them, and the crowd broke. The plaza opened 18 months later. They redesigned it around her. The original architectural plans had called for a rectangular commercial complex with a central courtyard and 4 floors of retail space. Liam had thrown the plans out. He had hired a new architect, a woman from Abuja who had built museums, and he had explained what he wanted. And the architect had listened and had gone away, and had come back 3 weeks later with a design that placed stall number 7 at the exact geographic center of the plaza, preserved in its original form. With a glass atrium rising 4 floors above it that let the morning light down onto the counter the way the morning light had come down onto the counter for 40 years, when the market roof had been corrugated iron patched with tarpaulin. Around the stall, the architect had designed a restaurant. A proper restaurant with tables and chairs and a full kitchen, but the stall itself remained at the heart of it, unchanged, with the hand-painted sign in its original place, and the wooden spoon her husband had carved for her mounted on the wall behind the counter in a small display case with a brass plaque. The restaurant was called Evelyn's Kitchen. The menu was her menu: ogi, akara, pepper soup, jollof rice on Sundays. The recipes were hers, written down for the first time in her life, because she had never written them down before, because she had carried them in her hands, the way a musician carries a song. And the head cook was a young woman of 22 named Blessing, who had been one of the 47 scholarship children. And the assistant cook was a young man of 19 named Emeka, who had been another. And every position in the restaurant, from the servers to the dishwashers, was held by a young person who had been fed by someone once and had grown up, and had been given a place to work by Liam Akaffer, who had understood the mathematics of it, which was that the person who feeds you when you are hungry does not want to be repaid, they want to be multiplied. Evelyn was the founding tenant. She was 82 by the time the plaza opened, and she was not going to work 6 mornings a week anymore, but she came on Wednesdays and Saturdays, because Blessing and Emeka wanted her there, and because the customers had begun asking for her, and because Evelyn had discovered that she was not quite finished being at a counter yet. The opening morning was a Thursday. Liam had chosen the day. He had not told anyone why he had chosen Thursday, but Evelyn had understood, because the last morning at the old market had been a Thursday, and Liam was a man who paid attention to the arithmetic of days. He arrived at 6 in the morning before the plaza officially opened in his black suit, the same suit he had worn at the market 20 months earlier, though he had not said this either. He walked into the atrium alone. He walked to stall number 7. Evelyn was already there. She had been there since 4, the way she had been at 4 every opening day for 40 years, and her charcoal fire had been replaced by a proper gas burner, but the pot was the same pot, and the wooden spoon was the same spoon, and the ogie was the same ogie. She served him. She wrapped one portion in newspaper, the way she had wrapped 10,000 portions before it. She placed it on the tray. Then she made one more portion quietly without ceremony, and she wrapped it in newspaper, and she placed it beside the first one, and she pushed the tray across the counter. "I made too much this morning," she said. "You would be doing me a favor if you took it off my hands." Liam took the tray. "Thank you, Ma," he said. "If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. See ya in the next story. Peace."